Widow, alone in a wooden cabin with her 2 children, hears footsteps in the snow outside just before midnight on New Year's Eve. When she opens the door, she finds a lone Comanche warrior offering help. What happens next will challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, grief, and survival. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The winter wind howled across the Texas plains on New Year's Eve of 1867, carrying with it the promise of snow and the weight of solitude. Catherine Morrison stood at the window of her small wooden cabin, her breath fogging the cold glass as she watched the sun descend behind the distant hills. Her auburn hair, usually tied back in a practical bun, had come loose in soft waves that framed her face, catching the orange light of the dying day. At 28 years old, she had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. The cabin, modest but sturdy, sat on the edge of what had once been a thriving settlement before the war had torn everything apart. Behind her, the warmth of the fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Her 2 children, Emma and Thomas, sat near the hearth. Emma, at 8 years old, was carefully mending one of her brother's shirts, her small fingers working the needle with surprising skill for someone so young. Thomas, barely 6, played quietly with a set of wooden horses their father had carved before he rode off to war 3 years ago and never returned. Catherine's heart ached as she watched them, these innocent souls who deserved so much more than the lonely existence she could provide. The loss of her husband, Jonathan, at the Battle of Nashville had shattered their world. The farm they had built together had fallen into disrepair without his strong hands to maintain it. The neighbors who had once been friendly had moved away, seeking safer lands farther east, away from the occasional Comanche raids that still haunted the frontier. Catherine had stayed, stubborn and proud, refusing to abandon the only home her children had ever known. But as winter deepened and their supplies dwindled, she wondered how much longer her determination could sustain them. She turned from the window, forcing a smile for her children. "Emma, Thomas, it's almost time for supper. Would you help me set the table?" Her voice was gentle but carried an underlying strength that had kept them going through the darkest times. Emma looked up with eyes the same deep blue as her father's, and Catherine felt that familiar pang of grief mixed with gratitude that she had these pieces of Jonathan still with her. As they moved about their evening routine, Catherine's mind drifted to the strange encounter from earlier that afternoon. She had been gathering firewood near the creek when she had seen him, a Comanche warrior, tall and powerfully built, sitting alone on his horse at the edge of the tree line. Unlike the war parties that occasionally passed through, he had been solitary, and something in his posture spoke of a deep weariness that transcended the physical. Their eyes had met across the distance, and for a moment, neither had moved. She should have been terrified, should have run back to the cabin to bar the door and load Jonathan's old rifle. Instead, she had stood frozen, recognizing in his dark eyes a loneliness that mirrored her own. He had worn traditional buckskin leggings and a heavy buffalo robe against the cold, his long black hair flowing free in the wind. Even from a distance, she could see the strength in his shoulders and arms, the kind of strength forged through years of surviving in this harsh land. But it was his face that had captured her attention. High cheekbones, strong jaw, and those eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless losses. He had not threatened her, had not even moved toward her. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few heartbeats, he had turned his horse and disappeared back into the trees, leaving Catherine standing there with her arms full of kindling and her heart pounding with an emotion she could not name. Now, as she served the meager stew she had prepared from their dwindling supplies, she tried to push the memory away. It was dangerous to think of a Comanche warrior as anything other than a threat. The settlements were full of stories about raids and violence, about families torn apart and lives destroyed. Yet she could not shake the feeling that the man she had seen was running from something, just as she was running from her own ghosts. "Mama, will we have a celebration for the new year?" Thomas asked, his young voice hopeful. Catherine's heart clenched. What could she offer them? They had no special food, no friends to invite, no reason to celebrate except that they had survived another year. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, ruffling his sandy hair. We'll stay up until midnight and make wishes for the coming year. How does that sound?" Emma smiled, though Catherine could see the understanding in her daughter's eyes. Emma knew how precarious their situation was, had grown up too fast in the wake of her father's death. As darkness fell completely, Catherine lit their precious candles, saving them for this one special night. The cabin glowed with soft light, creating an illusion of warmth and safety against the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. They sang songs, old hymns that Jonathan had loved, and Catherine told stories of better times, of when the children were babies, and the world had seemed full of promise. But as the hours crept toward midnight, a sound outside made Catherine freeze. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, her body positioning itself between her children and the door. Emma pulled Thomas close, both children's eyes wide with fear they had learned to hide but never truly overcome. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Catherine's fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the rifle, her heart hammering so hard she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. Then, a voice, deep and accented but speaking clear English. "I mean no harm. I bring meat for the cold night." Catherine's breath caught. It was him, the warrior from the creek. Every instinct screamed at her to send him away, to protect her children from this unknown danger. But another part of her, the part that had recognized the loneliness in his eyes, the part that understood what it meant to be utterly alone in an unforgiving world, hesitated. "Why?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why would you help us?" There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a pain that resonated with her own. "Because it is the last night of a hard year, and no one should face it alone. Because I have lost all that I held dear, and perhaps kindness to strangers is all that remains to give meaning to survival." Catherine looked at her children. Emma nodded slowly, her young face showing a wisdom beyond her years. Thomas, still innocent enough to believe in goodness, whispered, "Maybe he's lonely too, Mama." With trembling hands, Catherine set down the rifle and moved to the door. She lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled it open, the cold air rushing in like a physical force. There he stood, even more imposing up close than he had been at a distance. He was perhaps 30 years old, his face marked with the lines of hardship and loss, his muscular frame wrapped in furs against the bitter cold. In his hands, he held the carcass of a deer, freshly killed and already dressed for cooking. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Catherine saw past the differences that should have made them enemies. She saw a man who had lost everything, just as she had. A survivor clinging to whatever shreds of humanity the cruel world had left him. "Come with us if you want," Catherine whispered, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. It was madness, inviting a Comanche warrior into her home on New Year's Eve. But sanity had not kept her warm or fed her children. Perhaps it was time to trust in something beyond fear and prejudice. He stepped inside, and she closed the door against the winter night. The warrior stepped across the threshold, and Catherine quickly closed the door behind him, sealing out the bitter wind that had followed him inside. He stood just inside the entrance, snow melting from his moccasins onto the wooden floor, his presence filling the small cabin with an energy that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. Emma and Thomas pressed closer together near the fireplace, their eyes wide but not panicked, watching this stranger with the careful attention children learned when survival depended on reading people correctly. "My name is Catherine Morrison," she said, her voice finding its strength. "These are my children, Emma and Thomas." She gestured to each child in turn, and they nodded politely, their mother's lessons in courtesy overriding their fear. The warrior inclined his head respectfully, his dark eyes moving from Catherine to the children, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. "I am called Running Bear among my people," he said, his English careful and measured, each word chosen with precision, though that people no longer exists as it once did. Catherine heard the weight of loss in those words, a grief that matched her own. She took the deer carcass from him, surprised by its weight, and carried it to the table. "You speak English well," she observed, trying to ease the tension that hung in the air like morning mist. Running Bear removed his heavy buffalo robe, revealing a buckskin shirt that emphasized the muscular build of his shoulders and chest. His arms bore scars, the kind earned through battle and survival, and Catherine found herself both intimidated and oddly drawn to this man who represented everything she had been taught to fear. "I lived for 2 years at a mission school when I was young," he explained, moving slowly so as not to alarm the children. "The priests taught me your language, your God, your ways. I returned to my people, but the learning remained." He lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the floor near the fire, deliberately making himself less imposing. Thomas, with the fearlessness of youth, took a tentative step toward him. "Are you really a warrior?" the boy asked, his voice filled with curiosity rather than fear. Running Bear's stern face softened into something approaching a smile. "I was," he said quietly. "Now I am simply a man trying to find his place in a world that has changed beyond recognition." Catherine began preparing the venison, her hands working automatically while her mind raced. She should be terrified, should be planning how to get this man out of her home as quickly as possible. Instead, she found herself wanting to know his story, to understand what had brought him to her door on this frozen night. "You said you lost everything," she ventured, slicing the meat with Jonathan's hunting knife. "What happened?" The firelight played across Running Bear's features as he stared into the flames, and Catherine saw the shadow of old pain cross his face. "The white man's sickness came to our camp last spring," he began, his voice low and heavy. "The spotted disease that kills so many of our people. My wife, beautiful and strong, died within days. My son, barely 3 winters old, followed her before the week was done. My parents, my sister, most of my band, all gone. I survived, though I did not wish to." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Even at 8 years old, she understood the devastating weight of such loss. Catherine felt her own throat tighten with sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "I lost my husband 3 years ago in the war. I know that kind of pain, though I cannot imagine losing a child." Their eyes met across the cabin, and in that exchange, something fundamental shifted. They were no longer white woman and Comanche warrior, symbols of opposing forces in a brutal conflict. They were simply 2 people who had been hollowed out by loss, and were somehow still standing, still breathing, still searching for a reason to continue. "The survivors of my band joined with other groups," Running Bear continued, his gaze returning to the fire. "But I could not stay. Everywhere I looked, I saw ghosts. Every child's laugh reminded me of my son. Every woman's voice echoed my wife's. So I left, wandered alone, trying to outrun the memories. But grief follows wherever you go." Catherine nodded, understanding perfectly. "I stayed here because leaving felt like abandoning the last pieces of my husband," she said softly, adding wild onions to the pot. "But staying has been like living in a tomb. Every corner of this cabin holds his memory. Every tool in the barn was shaped by his hands." Thomas had crept closer to Running Bear, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial wariness. "Can you teach me to track animals like you do?" he asked, his young face eager. "Mama tries, but she says Papa was better at it." Running Bear looked to Catherine for permission, and she found herself nodding. "He needs a man's guidance," she admitted, the words painful but true. "I do my best, but there are things I cannot teach him." "I would be honored to share what I know," Running Bear said to Thomas, and the boy's face lit up with joy. Emma, not to be left out, moved closer as well, her initial fear dissolving in the warmth of the fire and the warrior's gentle demeanor. As Catherine cooked the venison, transforming it into a stew far richer than anything they had eaten in months, the cabin filled with the aroma of food, and something else, something intangible but powerful, the possibility of connection, of healing, of moving beyond the pain that had defined them all for so long. Running Bear told the children stories of the plains, of buffalo hunts and star-filled nights, of a way of life that was disappearing like snow in spring. His voice was mesmerizing, deep and rhythmic, and Catherine found herself pausing in her work to listen, transported to a world she had never known. When the stew was ready, Catherine served it in their mismatched bowls, and they ate together, this unlikely group united by circumstance and loneliness. The food was delicious, the best meal they had shared in months, and Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the simple joy of having enough, of watching her children eat their fill. Why did you come to us specifically? Catherine asked as they finished eating. You could have spent this night anywhere. Why here? Running Bear set down his bowl, his expression thoughtful. I saw you today at the creek, he admitted. I saw a woman alone, gathering wood in the cold, working with determination despite obvious hardship. I saw strength in you, and courage. And in your eyes, I saw the same loneliness that haunts my own reflection. I thought perhaps we might help each other survive this night. Catherine felt her cheeks warm, though whether from the fire or his words, she could not say. I saw you too, she confessed. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. Or perhaps I was, but not of you. Of what you represented, maybe. Of the unknown. Fear of the unknown is wise, Running Bear said. But sometimes the known world holds more danger than what lies beyond our understanding. He glanced at the children who were beginning to yawn despite their fascination with their unusual guest. Your children are strong, like their mother. They will survive whatever comes. With help, Catherine said firmly, meeting his gaze. We all need help sometimes. Even the strongest among us cannot stand alone forever. She hesitated, then spoke the thought that had been forming in her mind since he entered her home. You could stay, not just tonight, but longer. The barn has shelter, and I have more work than I can manage alone. Thomas needs someone to teach him the skills his father would have. Emma needs to see that not all strangers are enemies. And she paused, surprised by her own boldness. I need to remember that I am more than just a ghost haunting my own life. Running Bear looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You would trust me? A Comanche warrior, enemy of your people, stranger to your ways? You are not my enemy, Catherine said quietly but with absolute certainty. You are a man who has suffered and survived, just as I have. You brought food to strangers on a cold night. You have been gentle with my children and respectful in my home. Those are the actions that define you, not the color of your skin or the language of your birth. The warrior was silent for a long moment, and Catherine saw emotions warring in his eyes. Hope battling against the cynicism earned through years of betrayal and loss, the desire for connection fighting against the safety of solitude. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with feeling. I accept your offer, Catherine Morrison. I will stay, and I will help however I can. Perhaps together we can build something new from the ruins of what we have lost. Emma clapped her hands together softly and Thomas grinned, already imagining the adventures to come. Catherine felt something unfurl in her chest, something she had thought dead and buried with Jonathan. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of survival, but the genuine hope for something better, something worth living for, rather than simply enduring. As midnight approached, they stood together at the window, watching the first snow of the new year begin to fall. Catherine found herself standing close to Running Bear, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to catch the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. When the distant church bell from the abandoned settlement rang out 12 times, marking the turn of the year, she impulsively reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm and alive, and she felt a jolt of something she had not experienced in years. Attraction, yes, but more than that. Recognition, the sense of having found someone who understood the depths she had descended to, and could walk beside her as she climbed back toward the light. Happy New Year, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. To new beginnings, Running Bear replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, and Catherine allowed herself to believe that perhaps, despite everything, happiness was still possible. The winter months that followed transformed Catherine's small homestead in ways she could never have imagined on that frozen New Year's Eve. Running Bear proved to be a man of his word, rising before dawn each day to tend to tasks that had become overwhelming for Catherine alone. He repaired the barn roof that had been leaking since the previous spring, replaced broken fence posts, and hunted game that kept their stores well stocked through the harshest weeks of winter. His presence brought not just physical help, but a sense of security that allowed Catherine to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. Thomas followed Running Bear everywhere, absorbing knowledge like parched earth drinks rain. The warrior taught him to read tracks in the snow, to move silently through the forest, to understand the language of animals and wind. Catherine watched from the cabin window as man and boy worked together, and she saw her son's confidence growing daily. He stood straighter now, laughed more freely, and the haunted look that had lingered in his eyes since his father's death was gradually fading. Emma, initially more reserved, found her own connection with Running Bear through his stories. In the evenings after supper, he would tell tales of Comanche history and tradition, of brave warriors and wise women, of the vast buffalo herds that once covered the plains like a living sea. Emma would sit at his feet, her blue eyes wide with wonder, and Catherine realized her daughter was learning that the world was far bigger and more complex than the simple divisions of friend and enemy she had been taught. But it was Catherine's own transformation that surprised her most. As the weeks passed, she found herself watching Running Bear with increasing awareness. The way his muscles flexed as he chopped wood, the quiet dignity with which he moved through each task, the gentleness in his hands when he helped Thomas string a bow or showed Emma how to weave grass into patterns. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, anticipating the sound of his footsteps returning to the cabin at day's end. One evening in late February, as a winter storm raged outside, they sat together by the fire after the children had gone to sleep. The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, the warmth and flickering light created an intimate sanctuary. Catherine was mending one of Thomas's shirts, her needle moving rhythmically through the fabric, while Running Bear carved a wooden doll for Emma's upcoming birthday. "You have given us so much," Catherine said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I don't know how we would have survived this winter without you." Running Bear looked up from his carving, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You would have survived," he said with quiet conviction. "You are stronger than you know, Catherine, but perhaps you would not have lived. There is a difference between surviving and truly living." She set down her mending, her hands suddenly trembling. "I was barely alive when you came to us," she admitted, the words pouring out like water breaking through a dam. "I was going through the motions, caring for my children, but inside I was hollow. I thought I would never feel whole again. I thought the best I could hope for was to endure until the children were grown and could make their own way." Running Bear set aside the half-finished doll and moved closer to her, his movements deliberate and careful. "And now?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Catherine met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Now I feel alive again. I feel things I thought were buried with Jonathan. Hope, joy, and something else, something I'm afraid to name because it seems impossible that I could feel this way again. Especially for—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. "For a Comanche warrior?" Running Bear finished gently. "For someone so different from what you expected your life to hold?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from hard work, warm and strong and real. "I have felt the same impossibility, Catherine. When I lost my wife and son, I believed my heart was dead. I thought I would wander alone until death finally claimed me, and I welcomed that fate. But then I saw you at the creek, and something stirred in the emptiness. When you invited me into your home, when you trusted me with your children, when you looked at me and saw a man rather than an enemy, my heart began to beat again." Catherine felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I care for you, Running Bear. More than I should, more than makes sense. I know the world would condemn us, that people would say it's wrong, that we're too different. But when I look at you, I don't see those differences. I see a good man, a kind man, someone who has brought light back into our lives." Running Bear raised his free hand to her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. The touch sent electricity through her entire body, awakening feelings she had thought lost forever. "The world has already taken so much from both of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Must we let it take this too? Must we deny what we feel because others cannot understand?" "No," Catherine whispered, leaning into his touch. "I have lost too much already. I will not lose this, will not lose you, because of fear or prejudice." Running Bear drew her closer, and Catherine came willingly, settling into his arms as naturally as if she had always belonged there. His embrace was strong and protective, yet tender in a way that made her feel cherished and safe. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other while the storm raged outside, finding in each other's arms a peace that had eluded them both for so long. "I love you, Catherine," Running Bear finally said, the words simple but weighted with absolute sincerity. "I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you protect your children while still opening your heart to possibility. I love the sound of your laugh and the fire in your eyes when you speak of things you believe in. I know it has not been long, but time means nothing when you have already lost everything and been given a second chance." Catherine lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining. "I love you too," she said, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I love your gentleness with my children, your quiet strength, the way you have honored the memory of what we both lost while helping us build something new. Jonathan will always be part of my heart, and I know your wife and son will always be part of yours. But there is room in the heart for more than one love, room to honor the past while embracing the future." Running Bear cupped her face in both hands, his eyes searching hers. "Are you certain? Once we cross this line, there is no going back. The world will not be kind to us." "I have never been more certain of anything," Catherine replied, her voice steady and sure. "Let the world say what it will. We have found each other in the darkness, and I will not let you go." He kissed her then, softly at first, a gentle brush of lips that asked permission and offered promise. Catherine responded, her arms winding around his neck, deepening the kiss as months of loneliness and longing found expression. It was nothing like kissing Jonathan had been, and she was glad of that. This was something entirely new, a connection forged not in the innocence of youth but in the hard-won wisdom of survival and loss. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, Running Bear rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Catherine," he said urgently. "Let me be a true father to Emma and Thomas. Let me stand beside you not just as a helper, but as your husband. Let us build a family from the ashes of what we lost." Catherine's breath caught. It was madness, truly madness. A white widow marrying a Comanche warrior would bring condemnation from both their worlds. But as she looked into Running Bear's eyes and saw the depth of his love and commitment, she knew her answer. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you. I don't know how we will make it work, but I know that I want to try. I know that you are the man I choose, the man I love, the man I want beside me for whatever time we are given." They sealed the promise with another kiss, this one filled with joy and relief and the sweet certainty of commitment. When they finally drew apart again, Catherine glanced toward the children's room. "We should tell them tomorrow," she said softly. "They deserve to know, to have a say in this decision." But Running Bear shook his head, smiling. "I think they already know," he said. "Children see what adults try to hide. Emma asked me last week if I was going to be her new father. Thomas has been calling me Bear instead of Running Bear for days now, as if he has already claimed me as family." Catherine laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "They are wiser than we are," she admitted. "They saw what we were too afraid to acknowledge." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Catherine gathered her children before breakfast, her hand clasped tightly in Running Bear's. "Emma, Thomas," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "Running Bear and I have something important to tell you. We have fallen in love and we want to become a true family. He has asked me to marry him, and I have said yes. But this decision affects all of us, and we want to know how you feel about it." Emma jumped up immediately, throwing her arms around both Catherine and Running Bear. "I'm so happy," she exclaimed, tears of joy streaming down her young face. "I love Running Bear, and I love seeing you smile again, Mama. You haven't smiled like this since Papa died." Thomas, more reserved but no less enthusiastic, tugged on Running Bear's sleeve. "Does this mean you will stay with us always?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. "You won't leave like Papa did?" Running Bear knelt down to the boy's level, his eyes serious. "I will stay with you always, Thomas. I promise you this with all my heart. I cannot replace your father, and I would never try to. But I will love you and your sister as my own children, and I will protect and care for this family until my last breath." Thomas nodded solemnly, then surprised them all by launching himself into Running Bear's arms. "I'm glad," he said simply. "I was afraid you would go away." They were married in the cabin 3 weeks later, with no witnesses except Emma and Thomas. There was no preacher to officiate, no legal document to make it binding in the eyes of the law. Instead, they created their own ceremony, blending traditions from both their backgrounds. Running Bear spoke the Comanche words of commitment, while Catherine recited the Christian marriage vows she had learned as a child. They exchanged gifts. Running Bear gave Catherine a necklace he had made from stones and leather, while she gave him a ring fashioned from a piece of Jonathan's old watch chain, a symbol of her past blessing their future. As spring arrived, transforming the harsh landscape into something green and alive, the small family flourished. Running Bear taught Catherine the skills he had learned from his people: how to read the land, how to use every part of the animals they hunted, how to find medicine in plants. She taught him to read and write English better, shared her knowledge of farming, helped him understand the changing world they all had to navigate. They faced challenges, certainly. When Catherine ventured into the distant town for supplies, she endured stares and whispers, heard the cruel comments about the Indian lover and worse. But she held her head high, refusing to be ashamed of the love she had found. Running Bear faced his own struggles, knowing that his presence put Catherine and the children at risk, that there were those who would harm them simply for accepting him. But together, they were stronger than apart, and they learned to weather each storm. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Emma and Thomas playing in the yard before them, Catherine leaned against Running Bear's shoulder with a contentment she had never thought to feel again. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Choosing this life with all its difficulties?" Running Bear wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Never," he said firmly. "You and the children are my life now, my purpose, my joy. Whatever challenges we face them together. That is all that matters." Catherine looked at her children, healthy and happy and loved, then at the man beside her, strong and devoted, and hers. The world they lived in was harsh and often cruel, but here, in this small corner of the frontier, they had built something precious, a family born not of blood alone but of choice, of courage, of love that transcended all boundaries. "To new beginnings," she whispered, echoing the words Running Bear had spoken on New Year's Eve. "To new beginnings," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And in that moment, surrounded by love and possibility, Catherine Morrison knew with absolute certainty that inviting that lonely warrior into her home on a frozen winter night had been the best decision of her life. They had come together as broken, solitary people and had become whole. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, a family forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the unbreakable strength of love.